The marble floors of Riverside Country Club echoed with my footsteps as I walked into the dining room. And there she was, my sister Penelope, draped in designer clothes I'd never seen before, wearing our grandfather's vintage Rolex like a trophy, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a champagne flute that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She looked up as I approached, her smile sharp as a blade, and that's when I knew my worst fears were about to become reality. She had done exactly what Grandfather Thaddeus had always suspected she would do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive club in Millbrook Heights, casting everything in an almost surreal golden glow. This place had been Grandfather's sanctuary for over 40 years, where he'd conducted business deals worth millions, and where he'd brought Penelope and me for Sunday brunches when we were children. Now, 3 months after his funeral, it felt like a battleground. Penelope gestured to the empty chair across from her with theatrical grace, her emerald green dress catching the light in a way that seemed calculated for maximum effect. Everything about her appearance screamed money, new money specifically, the kind of money that came from somewhere recent and substantial. "Darling sister," she purred, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Thank you for finally agreeing to meet me. I know you've been processing everything since Grandfather's passing, but we really do need to discuss the estate settlement." I slid into the leather chair, my stomach already churning with anticipation. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of grief, funeral arrangements, and legal meetings. Grandfather Thaddeus had been more than a grandfather to me. He'd been a mentor, a friend, and the one person who truly understood my dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. While Penelope had always been his golden child in public, charming everyone with her wit and beauty, I had been the one who spent quiet evenings with him in his study, discussing life, values, and what really mattered. "I've been dealing with medical school finals and my residency applications," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the growing unease in my chest. "But yes, let's discuss the estate." Penelope's smile widened, and she leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Well, I have some rather significant news to share with you, Cassandra." She paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. "It seems our dear grandfather's will has been clarified." My blood ran cold. Clarified how? She reached into her designer handbag, a Hermes that I was certain hadn't been in her collection before, and pulled out a thick manila folder. The legal documents inside were crisp and official-looking, bearing the letterhead of Whitmore & Associates, the most prestigious law firm in Millbrook Heights. "It turns out," Penelope continued, her voice taking on a tone of mock sympathy, "that Grandfather's original will contained some ambiguous language about the distribution of his assets. The lawyers had to do extensive research into his true intentions, and, well..." She spread the documents across the table like she was revealing a winning poker hand. "The vast majority of his estate, the mansion on Elmwood Drive, the stock portfolio, the art collection, the Swiss accounts, it all comes to me." I stared at the papers, my vision blurring slightly as I tried to process what I was seeing. According to these documents, I was receiving only a small trust fund that would provide a modest monthly allowance, while Penelope inherited everything else. The family fortune that Grandfather had built over decades of shrewd business deals and careful investments, worth an estimated $12 million, was now apparently hers. "This is impossible," I whispered, my hands trembling as I picked up one of the documents. "Grandfather always said he was leaving everything equally between us. He told me just last Christmas that he wanted to make sure I could finish medical school without debt, that he wanted to set up a foundation for underprivileged children's health care." Penelope's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, sweet, naive Cassandra. Grandfather said a lot of things to a lot of people, but what matters is what's written in legally binding documents, witnessed and notarized." She tapped the papers with one perfectly polished nail. "And these documents clearly show that while he loved you dearly, he recognized that I have the business acumen and maturity to handle the family wealth responsibly." The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about all those evenings in Grandfather's study, how he'd spoken about legacy and character, how he'd always emphasized that true wealth came from helping others. Had it all been empty words? Had I completely misunderstood our relationship? "But the foundation we discussed," I said desperately. "The children's hospital wing he wanted to fund." "Will be established," Penelope interrupted smoothly. "Under my guidance, of course. I'll be making those decisions now, as the primary beneficiary of the estate." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to one of feigned concern. "Look, I know this is difficult to accept, but Grandfather was a practical man. He saw how you struggled with money management during college, how you always had your head in medical textbooks instead of learning about investments and business. He wanted to make sure the family wealth was preserved for future generations." I felt like I was drowning. Every word she spoke seemed designed to cut deeper, to make me question everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Grandfather Thaddeus. The worst part was that some of what she said wasn't entirely untrue. I had always been more focused on my studies than on money, more interested in healing people than in building wealth. "There's more," Penelope continued, and I braced myself for another blow. "The house on Elmwood Drive? I'll be moving in next month. I thought you should know so you can retrieve any personal items you might have left there." She paused, watching my reaction carefully. "I've already had the locks changed for security purposes, but I'm happy to arrange a supervised visit." The house on Elmwood Drive. The sprawling Victorian mansion where I'd spent countless weekends and holidays, where Grandfather had taught me to play chess in front of the massive stone fireplace, where I'd first told him about my dream of becoming a doctor. The thought of Penelope living there, of her erasing all those precious memories, was almost unbearable. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would he do this? Why would he lie to me?" Penelope's expression softened slightly, but I could see the calculation behind her sympathy. "He didn't lie, darling. He simply evolved in his thinking. Grandfather was getting older, and I think he began to worry about your impractical nature. Medical school is admirable, but it's not exactly a path to financial security. He wanted to ensure the family legacy remained intact." As I sat there, surrounded by the opulence of the country club where our family had been members for generations, I felt smaller and more insignificant than I ever had in my life. Everything I had believed about my future, about Grandfather's faith in me, about my place in the family, it was all crumbling around me like a house of cards. But somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the shock and heartbreak, something else was stirring. A small voice that reminded me of something Grandfather had once told me during one of our chess games. "Cassandra, my dear, the most important moves in chess are often the ones your opponent cannot see coming." At the time, I thought he was just teaching me strategy. Now, as I looked across the table at my sister's triumphant smile, I wondered if he had been preparing me for something else entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Penelope wasn't finished. I could see it in her eyes, that predatory gleam she'd had since we were children whenever she was about to deliver the killing blow. She reached back into her handbag and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that housed precious jewelry. My heart stopped as she opened it, revealing the one thing I thought would never leave our family. "Oh, and there's this," she said casually, lifting out Grandfather Thaddeus's signet ring, the family heirloom that had been passed down through 5 generations of Ashworth men. The heavy gold band caught the afternoon light, its engraved coat of arms glinting like a taunt. Apparently Grandfather wanted me to have this, too, to pass on to my future children since, well... She paused, sliding the ring onto her thumb, where it hung loose but unmistakably present. "Since you've never shown much interest in starting a family." The words hit me like a physical blow. That ring had been on Grandfather's finger for as long as I could remember. When I was 8 years old and recovering from pneumonia, he'd let me hold it while he told me stories about our ancestors, how each man who wore it had built something meaningful, something that helped others. Just last year, during one of our chess games, he'd casually mentioned that tradition might need to evolve with the times. "That ring," I managed to say through the tightness in my throat, "was supposed to go to the next family leader. Grandfather always said it would go to whoever carried on the family's legacy of service." Penelope's laugh was sharp and bright, carrying across the hushed dining room of the country club. Several other patrons turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding at our table. "Oh, darling, that's exactly what's happening. I'm planning to use the family resources to expand Ashworth Industries. Real estate development, tech investments, green energy projects. Things that will actually multiply our wealth instead of just giving it away to charity cases." The casual dismissal of everything Grandfather had valued, his commitment to philanthropy, his belief in helping those less fortunate, made my stomach turn. But Penelope wasn't done dismantling my world. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a photo gallery. "Actually, since we're being completely transparent here, there's something else you should know." She turned the screen toward me, revealing a series of images that made my blood freeze. The photos showed Penelope in Grandfather's study, our grandfather's sacred space, where he'd made his most important decisions, and where I'd spent countless hours learning about business ethics and family responsibility. But these weren't recent photos. Based on Penelope's hairstyle and clothing, they had been taken months ago, possibly even before Grandfather's death. "These were taken during my regular visits with Grandfather over the past year," she explained, her voice taking on a tone of mock innocence. "You see, while you were buried in your medical textbooks and cadaver labs, I was actually spending quality time with him, discussing his concerns about the future of the family wealth." I stared at the images in disbelief. There was Penelope, sitting in Grandfather's chair behind his massive oak desk, looking through financial documents. Another showed her standing beside the wall safe that I didn't even know existed. In a third photo, she was holding what appeared to be a thick legal document, smiling confidently at the camera. "He was quite worried about your impractical nature," Penelope continued, swiping through more photos. "All those late nights you spent at the hospital volunteering, all that talk about setting up free clinics and working with underprivileged children. He began to realize that you saw money as something to be given away rather than something to be preserved and grown." My mind was reeling. When were these taken? Why didn't he tell me you were having these meetings? "Every Tuesday afternoon for nearly 8 months, she replied smoothly. "While you were in pathology lab or whatever medical thing you were doing. Grandfather felt it was important to prepare me for the responsibilities that would eventually fall on my shoulders." She paused, studying my shocked expression with obvious satisfaction. "He was particularly concerned after that conversation you two had about liquidating some of his stock portfolio to fund your little children's hospital dream." I remembered that conversation vividly. It had been last spring, during one of our Sunday chess games. I'd been passionate, perhaps overly idealistic, about the difference we could make with strategic charitable giving. Grandfather had listened thoughtfully, asking probing questions about sustainability and long-term impact. I thought he was genuinely considering the proposal. Now I realized he might have been evaluating my fitness to inherit family wealth. "But he always encouraged my medical career," I said weakly, grasping for some thread of the relationship I thought I'd understood. "He paid for my undergraduate education. He was so proud when I got into medical school." "Of course he was proud," Penelope said, her tone becoming almost patronizing. "Medical school is a wonderful accomplishment. But being proud of someone's achievements doesn't mean trusting them with generational wealth." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He told me about your plan to defer your residency to work with Doctors Without Borders. Very noble, very admirable, but hardly the mindset of someone ready to manage a $12 million estate. The room felt like it was spinning. That plan, my dream of spending a year providing medical care in underserved communities, had been something I'd shared with Grandfather in confidence. I'd been so excited about the opportunity to make a real difference, to use my skills where they were desperately needed. The fact that he'd shared this with Penelope, had used it as evidence against my character, felt like the deepest betrayal of all. "There's one more thing," Penelope said, and I braced myself for another blow. She pulled out a final document, this one bearing the seal of Millbrook Heights Municipal Court. "I'm also inheriting Grandfather's position on the hospital board of directors. You know, the position he always said would be perfect for someone who understood both healthcare and business? The board position." Grandfather had mentioned it dozens of times, always with a knowing smile, always suggesting that someday I might be qualified to fill such a role. It was the bridge between my medical aspirations and the family's philanthropic legacy, a way to use business acumen to improve healthcare for everyone in our community. "But I don't have a business degree," I protested weakly. "Exactly," Penelope said with finality. "Which is why the board voted unanimously to accept my appointment. My MBA from Wharton and my experience in strategic consulting make me much more qualified to guide healthcare investment decisions." As I sat there, staring at the documents scattered across the table like the fragments of my shattered future, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, but my fundamental understanding of who I was and where I belonged in the world. Everything I had believed about my relationship with Grandfather Thaddeus, everything I had planned for my future, everything I thought I knew about family loyalty, it was all crumbling into dust. Penelope began gathering the papers with the efficiency of someone who had won a decisive victory. "I hope you understand that this isn't personal, Cassandra. It's just business." Grandfather was a practical man who wanted to ensure the family legacy would continue to grow and prosper. He knew I had the skills and temperament to make that happen. She stood up, adjusting her designer dress and checking her reflection in the window. "I've arranged for a monthly trust payment of $3,000 to help with your living expenses during medical school. It's quite generous, really, considering you'll essentially be taken care of without having to worry about the burden of managing significant wealth." $3,000 a month. It was more than many people had, but it was a fraction of what I'd expected, what I'd counted on to pay for medical school, to fund my research, to eventually establish the charitable foundations that Grandfather and I had dreamed about together. As Penelope prepared to leave, she turned back with one final observation that cut deeper than all the rest. "You know, Cassandra, Grandfather always said that the most important quality in a leader was the ability to make difficult decisions for the greater good. Sometimes that means recognizing that your dreams and the family's needs don't align." She smiled that perfect, cold smile one last time. "I think you'll find that this arrangement is actually a blessing in disguise. Now you can focus completely on your medical career without the distraction of family business responsibilities." And with that, she walked away, leaving me alone at the table with the wreckage of everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and my future. I watched Penelope settle back into her chair with the satisfaction of a cat who had just cornered a mouse. She wasn't done. I could see it in the way she carefully arranged the legal documents in front of her, creating a barrier of official papers between us. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the dining room, and the other patrons had mostly cleared out, leaving us in an almost empty space that felt increasingly like an interrogation room. "Actually," she said, pulling out yet another folder from her seemingly bottomless handbag, "since we're having this conversation, I think you deserve to know exactly how this all came together. It's quite a fascinating story, really." My stomach clenched. Whatever was coming next, I knew it would be worse than what I'd already heard. Penelope opened the new folder and spread out what appeared to be medical documents. I recognized the letterhead of Millbrook General Hospital, where I'd been volunteering in the pediatric ward for the past 2 years. "Do you remember Dr. Harrison Fletcher from the neurology department?" I nodded slowly. Dr. Fletcher had been one of Grandfather's longtime friends and personal physicians. He'd also been my unofficial mentor at the hospital, someone I'd looked up to and trusted completely. "Well, it turns out Dr. Fletcher was quite concerned about some of your behavior during your volunteer work," Penelope continued, her voice taking on a tone of feigned concern. "He documented several incidents where you showed what he called concerning emotional instability while working with patients." She slid the first document toward me. It was a formal report, dated 6 months ago, describing an incident where I had allegedly become overly emotional and unprofessionally involved with a 7-year-old patient who was dying of leukemia. The report claimed I had been found crying in a supply closet after the child's condition worsened, and that I had to be, quote, counseled about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I remembered that day vividly. Little Timothy Rodriguez had taken a turn for the worse, and yes, I had stepped away to collect myself after delivering difficult news to his parents. But it hadn't been unprofessional breakdown. It had been a moment of human compassion that I thought showed my dedication to patient care. "There's more," Penelope said, producing another document. This one described an incident where I had allegedly, quote, argued aggressively with senior medical staff about treatment protocols for underprivileged patients. According to the report, I had been insubordinate and disruptive during a department meeting. Again, the facts were twisted beyond recognition. I had advocated passionately for a young patient whose family couldn't afford certain medications, proposing that the hospital's charitable fund cover the costs. The discussion had been heated but professional, exactly the kind of advocacy I thought defined good medicine. Dr. Fletcher felt it was his duty to share these concerns with Grandfather, Penelope explained, her tone becoming almost sympathetic. He was worried that your emotional instability might be a sign of deeper psychological issues that could affect your judgment in high-pressure situations. And given that you would potentially be managing significant family resources, the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "You orchestrated this," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You got Dr. Fletcher to write these reports." Penelope's smile was razor-sharp. "I didn't get him to do anything. I simply shared some observations about incidents I had witnessed during my own volunteer work at the hospital. As a concerned sister, of course." That was when I remembered. Penelope had started volunteering at Millbrook General about 8 months ago, right around the time she claimed to have been having those Tuesday meetings with Grandfather. At the time, I'd been thrilled that she was finally showing interest in healthcare and community service. I had even encouraged her involvement, helped her get oriented with the volunteer program. "You were spying on me," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I was observing," she corrected smoothly, "and what I observed was a pattern of behavior that raised serious questions about your fitness to handle responsibility. The crying incident, the argumentative meetings, the way you would get so emotionally invested in individual cases that you lost sight of the bigger picture." She pulled out her phone again and showed me a series of photos I hadn't seen before. These were taken at the hospital, images of me during some of my most vulnerable moments. One showed me hugging the mother of a patient who had just received good news about her son's recovery. Another captured me during a particularly intense conversation with a colleague about improving access to pediatric mental health services. "You photographed me without my knowledge," I said, horror creeping into my voice. "I documented concerning behavior patterns," Penelope replied without a trace of remorse. "Grandfather needed to understand what kind of decision-maker you really were." These photos, combined with Dr. Fletcher's professional observations, painted a clear picture of someone who was too emotionally volatile to be trusted with significant financial decisions. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. Every act of compassion, every moment of genuine human connection, every instance of advocating for patients, it had all been twisted into evidence of my unfitness to inherit family wealth. But the worst part, Penelope continued, clearly enjoying my growing horror, was discovering your secret communications with that radical organization. She produced a printout of email correspondence that made my blood run cold. The emails were between me and representatives from Global Health Alliance, a nonprofit organization that worked to provide medical care in conflict zones and impoverished regions. We had been discussing their fellowship program, which would allow me to spend a year providing medical services in refugee camps and underserved communities. Grandfather was particularly disturbed by your plan to give away family resources to fund your participation in this program, Penelope said, pointing to one specific email where I had mentioned the possibility of making a personal donation to support their work. A $250,000 donation, Cassandra. You were planning to give away $250,000 of family money to support what essentially amounts to medical tourism in dangerous, politically unstable regions. The email was real, but the context was completely distorted. I had mentioned the donation as a long-term possibility, something I might consider after establishing my medical career and building my own wealth. It was a dream, not a concrete plan, and certainly not something I would have done without extensive family discussion. You made it sound like I was planning to bankrupt the family, I said weakly. Weren't you? Penelope shot back. Between the Children's Hospital Wing, the Global Health Alliance donation, the free clinic proposals, and your general philosophy that wealth should be distributed rather than preserved. Yes, Cassandra, you absolutely were planning to bankrupt the family. Maybe not intentionally, but the result would have been the same. She began organizing the documents into neat stacks, each pile representing another aspect of the case she had built against me. Grandfather spent weeks going over all of this evidence with his lawyers. The medical reports, the financial projections of your charitable proposals, the psychological evaluation that Dr. Fletcher recommended, it all pointed to the same conclusion. What psychological evaluation? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Penelope smiled that cold, calculating smile again. The one Dr. Fletcher conducted during your regular conversations with him. You know those mentoring sessions where you opened up about your dreams, your fears, your passionate beliefs about social justice and healthcare reform? He was documenting everything, Cassandra. Every idealistic statement, every emotional revelation, every indication that you prioritized feeling over logic. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that I felt like I was drowning. Dr. Fletcher, whom I had trusted as a mentor and friend, had been evaluating my psychological fitness the entire time. Every conversation where I had shared my hopes and dreams, every moment where I had been vulnerable about my fears and aspirations, it had all been evidence gathering for a case I didn't even know was being built against me. The final straw, Penelope continued, was when you told Dr. Fletcher about your plan to defer your residency. Grandfather saw that as proof that you weren't serious about building a sustainable career, that you were more interested in playing savior to the world than in taking responsibility for your own life. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds of the country club. You know, Cassandra, I actually tried to warn you. Remember last Christmas when I suggested you might want to be more strategic about your conversations with Grandfather? When I mentioned that he was getting older and might be more conservative in his thinking? I did remember. At the time, I had dismissed her comments as typical Penelope cynicism. Now I realized she had been giving me a chance to modify my behavior, to present myself in a more acceptable light. But I had been too naive, too trusting, too convinced of the strength of my relationship with Grandfather to see the danger I was in. The beautiful irony, Penelope said, turning back to face me, is that your own compassion and honesty were what sealed your fate. If you had been more calculating, more strategic about what you shared and when, you might have presented a different picture. But you were so genuine, so open about your bleeding heart idealism, that you made the case against yourself. As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave, Penelope delivered one final blow that would haunt me for months to come. Grandfather's exact words to me were, "Penelope, I love Cassandra dearly, but love and trust are two different things. I can love someone and still recognize that they're not suited for certain responsibilities." He said you reminded him of his brother Thomas. Brilliant, passionate, well-intentioned, but ultimately too naive and generous for the harsh realities of preserving family wealth across generations. Great Uncle Thomas. The family cautionary tale. The Ashworth heir, who had given away most of his inheritance to various causes and died nearly penniless, dependent on family charity in his final years. I had never met him, but his story had been told as a warning about the dangers of unchecked generosity. Now apparently I was following in his footsteps. The silence that followed Penelope's revelation about Great-Uncle Thomas felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I sat there, staring at the remnants of legal documents scattered across the table, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I ever had in my entire 26 years of life. The late afternoon sun had shifted again, casting the dining room in darker shadows that seemed to mirror the bleakness settling over my future. Penelope returned to her seat, but this time she leaned forward with an expression that might have been mistaken for sisterly concern if I hadn't just witnessed the calculated destruction of everything I held dear. She reached across the table and placed her manicured hand over mine, a gesture that once might have comforted me but now felt like a spider's touch. "Now, before you spiral into one of your emotional episodes," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd perfected over the years, "I want you to know that I haven't forgotten about family loyalty. Despite everything that's happened, despite the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Grandfather's final decisions, I still care about your well-being." She paused, letting the words sink in while I struggled to process the cognitive dissonance of hearing about family loyalty from someone who had just systematically destroyed my life over the course of 8 months. "Which is why," she continued, reaching into her handbag once more, "I've prepared a very generous offer that will allow you to maintain your dignity while accepting the reality of your new circumstances." The document she placed in front of me was titled Family Support Agreement and bore the same legal letterhead as all the other papers that had demolished my world. As I read through the dense legal language, the true scope of my humiliation became clear. The agreement offered me a monthly stipend of $3,000, as she had mentioned earlier, but with conditions that made my stomach turn. I would be required to submit monthly financial reports showing how the money was spent. Any expenditure over $500 would require pre-approval from Penelope. I would be prohibited from making any public statements about the family estate or inheritance matters. Most degradingly, I would be required to attend quarterly family counseling sessions, with a therapist of Penelope's choosing to address my financial responsibility issues. "Think of it as a structured path toward financial maturity," Penelope explained, her tone suggesting she genuinely believed she was offering me a gift. "The monthly reporting requirement will help you develop budgeting skills, and the counseling sessions will address some of the impulsive tendencies that concerned Grandfather. It's really quite thoughtful when you think about it." I looked up from the document, searching her face for any sign that she understood how completely demeaning this offer was. But I saw only the satisfied expression of someone who believed they were being remarkably generous to an ungrateful recipient. "And if I don't sign this?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Penelope's expression shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of the steel beneath her polished exterior. "Well, technically, you're not entitled to anything beyond what's specified in Grandfather's revised will. The $3,000 monthly payments aren't actually mandatory. They're a voluntary family support gesture that I would be providing out of my own generosity." The implication was clear. Sign this humiliating agreement or receive nothing at all. "There's one more provision I should mention," she added, flipping to the final page of the document. Given your stated intention to pursue medical work in unstable international regions, the agreement includes a travel restriction clause. You would be prohibited from leaving the continental United States without written permission, which would only be granted for approved educational or medical training purposes. My dreams of working with Global Health Alliance, of providing medical care in refugee camps and underserved communities around the world, even those were being stripped away. The travel restriction would effectively prevent me from pursuing the kind of humanitarian work that had inspired me to become a doctor in the first place. You're trying to control every aspect of my life, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying to protect you from your own poor judgment, Penelope corrected smoothly. Grandfather was right to be concerned about your tendency toward impulsive, emotionally driven decisions. This agreement provides structure and accountability that will help you develop better decision-making skills. She glanced at her expensive watch, a Cartier that I was now certain had been purchased with family money that should have been partly mine. I know this is a lot to process, so I'm not going to pressure you for an immediate decision. You have until Friday to review the agreement and make your choice. Friday. 3 days to decide whether to sign away my autonomy and dignity in exchange for a degrading monthly allowance, or to refuse and face complete financial exile from the only family I had left. What happens to the children's hospital wing? I asked, grasping for some remnant of the dreams Grandfather and I had shared. The foundation for underprivileged healthcare that we discussed? Penelope's smile was patient but condescending. Oh, that will definitely happen, just in a more sustainable and professionally managed way. I'm already in discussions with several healthcare consulting firms about the most efficient allocation of charitable resources. We want to make sure any philanthropic investments generate measurable returns in terms of community impact and tax benefits. The clinical language made my heart sink. She was talking about turning Grandfather's passionate vision for helping sick children into a sterile business calculation designed to maximize tax advantages and public relations benefits. But what about the free clinic we planned, the mobile medical units for rural communities, the scholarship program for medical students from low-income families? All lovely ideas, Penelope said dismissively, but not necessarily the most effective use of resources. The consulting firms I'm working with have much more sophisticated approaches to healthcare philanthropy. Data-driven strategies that focus on systemic change rather than feel-good individual interventions. I realized with growing horror that she was essentially describing the corporate approach to charity, carefully calculated donations designed more for tax benefits and public image than for genuine human impact. Everything Grandfather had taught me about the responsibility that came with wealth, about using resources to directly help people in need, was being transformed into something cold and strategic. There's something else you should understand, Penelope continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The agreement includes a non-disclosure clause regarding family financial matters. If you choose not to sign, and you attempt to contest any aspect of the inheritance, or make public statements about feeling wronged by the family's decisions, there could be legal consequences. What kind of legal consequences? Defamation, interference with business relationships, breach of confidentiality. The family lawyers have been quite creative in outlining potential charges. And of course, any legal action would be expensive to defend against, especially for someone with limited financial resources. The threat was barely veiled. Sign the humiliating agreement and accept my new role as a financially controlled dependent, or face the possibility of expensive legal battles I couldn't afford to fight. As I sat there staring at the document that would essentially transform me from a family member into a charity case, I felt the last remnants of my old life crumbling away. The medical school dreams that I could no longer afford, the international humanitarian work that was now forbidden, the charitable foundations that would be twisted into corporate tax strategies, the simple dignity of making my own financial decisions. All of it was being stripped away with surgical precision. I need to think about this, I said finally, my voice hollow. Of course you do, Penelope replied, gathering up her documents with the efficiency of someone who had just completed a successful business negotiation. Take all the time you need, until Friday, that is. And Cassandra? She paused, looking at me with what might have been genuine concern if I hadn't just witnessed her calculated cruelty. I really do hope you'll make the wise choice here. Fighting this will only make things harder for everyone, especially you. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress, and checking her reflection in the window one final time. Oh, and you should know, I've already spoken with the financial aid office at your medical school. Given the change in your family financial status, you'll need to reapply for student loans and grants for your final year. I thought you should have time to prepare for that process. The final blow. Even my education, which I had thought was secure, was now in jeopardy. Without family financial support, completing medical school would require taking on crushing debt that the $3,000 monthly payments would barely help manage. I'll have my driver take you home, Penelope offered, but I shook my head. The thought of accepting even that small gesture felt like another step toward the complete dependence she was trying to create. As I watched her walk away, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor, I realized that this wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about power, control, and the systematic dismantling of everything that made me who I thought I was. I sat alone in the empty dining room as the sun set outside, surrounded by the ghosts of Sunday brunches with Grandfather, feeling more lost and powerless than I had ever imagined possible. I drove home through the darkening streets of Millbrook Heights in a daze, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I replayed every devastating moment of the afternoon. The familiar neighborhoods that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed foreign and unwelcoming, as if the very landscape had changed along with my circumstances. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of my modest apartment complex, a stark contrast to the luxury I had grown up expecting, I sat in my car for several minutes, unable to summon the energy to climb the stairs to my small one-bedroom unit. The apartment felt suffocating when I finally entered. Everything about it seemed to mock my new reality. The medical textbooks stacked on my desk that I might not be able to afford to finish using, the acceptance letter from the Global Health Alliance Fellowship Program, pinned to my bulletin board like a cruel joke, the photos of Grandfather and me during happier times that now felt like evidence of my own naivete. I collapsed onto my couch and stared at the ceiling, trying to process the impossibility of what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, my entire understanding of my life, my family, and my future had been completely demolished. But as I lay there in the growing darkness, something began to nag at the edges of my consciousness, a small inconsistency that I couldn't quite identify. It started with a memory from 6 months ago, during one of my last conversations with Grandfather in his study. We had been discussing my plans for the fellowship with Global Health Alliance, and I remembered being surprised by how specific his questions had been. He hadn't just asked general questions about my goals and motivations. He had asked very detailed questions about the organization's structure, their funding sources, and their selection criteria for fellows. At the time, I had assumed he was simply being thorough, perhaps considering a donation to support their work. But now, thinking back on the conversation, his questions seemed almost investigative, as if he had been gathering information rather than just showing grandfatherly interest. The more I thought about it, the more other small details began to surface. Like the way Grandfather had always seemed to know about Penelope's volunteer work at the hospital before I had mentioned it to him, or how he had never seemed surprised by any of the volunteer. He enticed Wallada. And there was something else. Something about the timing of Dr. Fletcher's reports that didn't quite add up. I got up and retrieved my laptop, suddenly needing to verify something that had been bothering me. I pulled up my email correspondence with Global Health Alliance and began scrolling through the dates. The first email in our exchange was dated 8.5 months ago, which meant I had initiated contact with them before Penelope had even started her surveillance campaign at the hospital. But according to her timeline, Grandfather's concerns about my radical associations had been sparked by discovering my communications with Global Health Alliance. If that were true, how had Penelope known to start documenting my behavior before I had even contacted the organization? Unless someone had told her to start watching me. Unless the entire surveillance operation had been planned from the beginning. I started pacing around my small living room, my mind racing as more inconsistencies emerged. Dr. Fletcher's first incident report was dated 7 months ago, describing my emotional reaction to little Timothy Rodriguez's deteriorating condition. But I clearly remembered that incident happening during my second week of volunteering, which would have been over 8 months ago, not 7. Someone had backdated the report. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone and called the hospital's volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks. She was a sweet woman in her 60s who had been managing the volunteer program for over a decade, and she had always been supportive of my work with the pediatric patients. "Cassandra, dear," she answered on the second ring, "how lovely to hear from you. I was just thinking about you the other day when Dr. Martinez mentioned how much the children in the cancer ward miss your visits." "Mrs. Hendricks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I have a somewhat unusual question. Do you keep records of when volunteers start and end their service?" "Of course, sweetheart. We have to maintain detailed records for insurance and liability purposes. Why do you ask?" "Could you tell me exactly when my sister Penelope began volunteering? I'm trying to sort out some family scheduling conflicts, and I can't remember the exact date." There was a pause as I heard her typing on her computer. "Let me see. Penelope Ashworth. Here we are." She submitted her application on March 15th and began volunteering on March 22nd. That would be about 7.5 months ago. 7.5 months. Not 8 months, as Penelope had claimed. The discrepancy was small, but it mattered because it meant she had started volunteering after Dr. Fletcher's first incident report was supposedly written, not before. "Mrs. Hendricks, one more question. Do you happen to remember who recommended Penelope for the volunteer program? Usually new volunteers need a reference from current volunteers or staff." Another pause. "That's interesting, actually." I remember being surprised because Penelope's application came with a reference from Dr. Fletcher himself. He specifically requested that she be assigned to the pediatric ward, which was unusual because most new volunteers start in less sensitive departments. My blood ran cold. Dr. Fletcher had recommended Penelope for the volunteer position and specifically requested that she be placed in the same department where I worked. The random discovery of my supposed emotional instability had been orchestrated from the very beginning. After thanking Mrs. Hendricks and hanging up, I sat down heavily on my couch, trying to process what this meant. If Dr. Fletcher had been involved in placing Penelope in position to spy on me, then the entire surveillance operation had been planned weeks or even months before it began. But why? And more importantly, who had initiated it? I thought about Grandfather's Tuesday afternoon meetings with Penelope, the ones she claimed had been happening for 8 months. If those meetings had really been going on that long, they would have started in January, nearly 2 months before Penelope even began volunteering at the hospital. What had they been discussing during those early meetings if not my supposedly concerning behavior? A new possibility began to form in my mind, one that was almost too strange to consider. What if the meetings hadn't been about responding to my behavior, but about planning to document it? What if Grandfather had deliberately set up a situation to test both Penelope and me, to see how we would behave when given the opportunity to either support or betray each other? The thought seemed impossible, but I couldn't shake the memory of something Grandfather had said to me last Christmas, during one of our chess games. I had been lamenting how difficult it was to know who to trust in the competitive world of medical school. and he had made an observation that had stuck with me. "The only way to truly know someone's character," he had said, moving his queen across the board in a strategy I didn't understand at the time, "is to give them the opportunity to choose between their own interests and doing what's right. Most people will reveal their true nature when they think the stakes are high enough and no one is watching." At the time, I had thought he was talking about my medical school classmates, but now I wondered if he had been talking about something much closer to home. I got up and walked to my bookshelf, where I kept a small wooden box containing mementos from my childhood. Inside was a collection of items I had saved over the years. Movie ticket stubs from family outings, birthday cards, photographs, and at the bottom, a small brass key that Grandfather had given me for my 16th birthday. "Every lock has a key," he had said when he gave it to me, "and every secret has a way of revealing itself to those who know where to look." I had assumed it was just a symbolic gift, something to commemorate my transition into young adulthood. But now, holding the key in my palm, I wondered if it had a more practical purpose. Grandfather had always been a man who planned for every contingency, who thought several moves ahead like the chess master he was. Had he anticipated this exact scenario? The key was small and old-fashioned, the kind that might open a desk drawer or a small safe. I had never tried to find out what it unlocked, respecting what I assumed was Grandfather's private business. But given everything that had happened today, I wondered if my respect for his privacy had been exactly the wrong approach. As I sat there in my dark apartment, holding the small brass key and thinking about chess strategies and carefully orchestrated tests, one thought kept returning to my mind. Grandfather Thaddeus had been playing a much longer game than any of us had realized. And I was beginning to suspect that the game wasn't over. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the small brass key warm in my palm, my mind churning through possibilities and half-formed theories. By dawn, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to break into Grandfather's house, my house, according to the original will I thought I understood, and find out what that key unlocked. The morning air was crisp as I drove through the familiar gates of the Elmwood Drive estate. Penelope had mentioned changing the locks, but she might not have thought to change the hidden spare key that Grandfather had shown me years ago, concealed behind a loose brick in the garden wall. My hands trembled as I felt along the weathered stones, and relief flooded through me when my fingers found the small magnetic box still tucked in its hiding place. The house felt different as I stepped inside, not just empty, but somehow expectant, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and my footsteps echoed hollowly on the hardwood floors as I made my way to Grandfather's study. The study looked exactly as it had during our last conversation 3 months ago. Grandfather's reading glasses still sat on the massive oak desk, and his favorite chess set remained positioned mid-game, as if he had simply stepped away for a moment. But now I was seeing the room through different eyes, searching for anything that might accept the small brass key I carried. I started with the obvious places: the desk drawers, the file cabinets, the antique secretary in the corner. None of them required the particular key I held. Growing more frustrated, I began examining the room more carefully, looking for hidden compartments or secret spaces that Grandfather might have built into his sanctuary. It was when I was running my hands along the elaborate crown molding that I noticed something odd about the bookshelf behind his desk. The shelf held his collection of first-edition medical textbooks, volumes on anatomy, surgery, and public health that had inspired his own philanthropic work in healthcare. But one section of books seemed slightly different from the others, positioned just a fraction of an inch forward from the rest. I pulled on the protruding volumes and felt them give way, revealing a hidden compartment built into the wall behind the bookshelf. Inside was a small metal box, old-fashioned and unadorned except for a tiny keyhole that looked like it would accept my brass key perfectly. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the quiet room. Inside the box was a thick manila envelope marked with my name in grandfather's distinctive handwriting, for Cassandra, to be opened only when you discover the truth about the test. The test. My heart was pounding as I tore open the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents that would change everything I thought I knew about the past 8 months. The first document was a letter in grandfather's handwriting, dated 6 months before his death. My dearest Cassandra, if you are reading this, then you have discovered the inconsistencies in Penelope's story and have begun to question the narrative she has constructed. I am both proud and relieved, as it means you have retained the critical thinking skills and investigative instincts that convinced me you were the right person to inherit not just my wealth, but my responsibility to use that wealth wisely. What you experienced over these past months was indeed a test, but not the test Penelope believes she orchestrated. She has been an unwitting participant in a much larger experiment designed to reveal the true character of both my granddaughters. I needed to know, before I entrusted my life's work to either of you, which one would choose integrity over greed when faced with the ultimate temptation. I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The letter continued. The inheritance documents Penelope showed you are genuine, but incomplete. They represent only one possible outcome of my estate plan, the outcome that would take effect if she chose to manipulate and betray you for personal gain. By filing those documents and claiming the inheritance through deception, she has disqualified herself from the true inheritance and activated an alternative distribution that I established months ago. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the paper steady. I forced myself to keep reading. You see, my dear, I have been aware of Penelope's character flaws for years. Her materialistic tendencies, her willingness to manipulate others for personal advantage, her fundamental lack of empathy for those less fortunate. But I also knew that simply excluding her from my will based on suspicions would be unfair. She deserved the opportunity to prove me wrong, to choose family loyalty over personal gain when the stakes were highest. I gave her that opportunity by sharing my concerns about your impractical charitable impulses and your plans for international humanitarian work. I shared these concerns not because I disapproved of your choices, quite the opposite, but because I wanted to see how she would respond to the opportunity to use this information against you. The room seemed to be spinning around me. Everything I had believed about grandfather's disapproval, about his loss of faith in my judgment, had been deliberately constructed to test Penelope's character. Dr. Fletcher's involvement was necessary to make the test credible. He is an old friend who understood the importance of what I was trying to accomplish. The quotes he provided to Penelope were fabricated, created specifically to give her the ammunition she would need if she chose to betray you. She was never supposed to use them. A person of true character would have refused to participate in such a scheme, regardless of the potential personal benefit. The fact that she not only used the false reports but expanded upon them, adding her own surveillance and manipulation, has revealed her true nature in ways that far exceeded my worst expectations. I thought about all those Tuesday afternoon meetings, about Penelope's systematic campaign to document my supposed emotional instability, about her obvious pleasure in destroying my dreams and expectations. She had been given every opportunity to choose loyalty over betrayal, and she had chosen betrayal at every single decision point. The next document in the envelope was a legal paper that made my hands shake even more violently. Codicil to the last will and testament of Thaddeus Ashworth, executed in the presence of witnesses and notarized on date 6 months before his death. The codicil was clear and devastating in its implications. If Penelope chose to file the, quote, preliminary inheritance documents and claim ownership of the estate through manipulation or deception, the true inheritance would automatically transfer to me, along with all assets that she believed she had stolen. The $3,000 monthly payments she had offered me would actually be paid from her own assets, as she would be left with only a small trust fund, ironically, the same size as the one she had tried to force me to accept. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. According to the codicil, the elaborate legal maneuvering that Penelope thought she had orchestrated, with the help of Whitmore and Associates, had actually been coordinated by a different law firm entirely, one that had been acting on my behalf from the beginning, creating the illusion of her legal victory while actually documenting her attempts at fraud and manipulation. The signet ring that Penelope is wearing, the letter continued, is a replica that I had made specifically for this test. The true family ring has been in a safety deposit box for the past year, waiting for the worthy heir to claim it. The box number and key are included in this envelope. I must also tell you that Dr. Fletcher has been keeping detailed records of Penelope's attempts to recruit him in her scheme against you. Every conversation, every fabricated report, every moment of her calculated betrayal has been documented and witnessed. Should she attempt to take legal action against the true inheritance distribution, these records will provide more than adequate evidence of her fraudulent behavior. The final paragraph of the letter brought tears to my eyes. Cassandra, you have proven yourself to be exactly the person I always believed you were. Your compassion for others, your integrity in the face of personal loss, your refusal to abandon your principles even when doing so would have been easier. These qualities convinced me long ago that you were the right person to carry on our family's tradition of using wealth to heal the world. The foundation you dreamed of establishing for underprivileged children's health care is not only possible now, it is fully funded and waiting for your leadership. The international humanitarian work you hope to pursue is not only permitted but encouraged, with full family financial support. You have passed the most important test of your life, my dear granddaughter, not by proving you could be ruthless or calculating, but by proving that you could remain true to yourself even when everything seemed lost. Welcome to your inheritance. Use it wisely, use it compassionately, and know that you have made an old man very proud. I sat in grandfather's chair, holding the letter and crying tears of relief, vindication, and overwhelming love for a man whose faith in me had never wavered, even when I had lost faith in myself. But even as the joy of discovery washed over me, I realized that the hardest part was still to come. Penelope had no idea that her apparent victory was actually her complete defeat, and I was going to have to be the one to tell her. I spent the rest of the morning in grandfather's study, carefully reading through every document in the hidden box and formulating my plan. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. Grandfather had truly thought of everything. Audio recordings of his conversations with Dr. Fletcher outlining the test parameters, copies of the real legal documents that superseded everything Penelope had shown me, and most damning of all, transcripts of Penelope's own words during her Tuesday meetings, where she had openly discussed her strategies for undermining my credibility. By noon, I had made my decision about how to handle the confrontation. I wouldn't simply reveal the truth all at once. That would be too merciful after what she had put me through. Instead, I would give Penelope exactly what she had given me, the slow, methodical destruction of her certainty, piece by piece, until she understood the full scope of her miscalculation. I called her cell phone, keeping my voice carefully neutral and defeated. Penelope, it's Cassandra. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I think I'm ready to discuss the family support agreement. The satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. I'm so glad you've come to your senses, darling. I was worried you might do something impulsive and make this harder on yourself. Could we meet this afternoon? Maybe at the house on Elmwood Drive? I'd like to see Grandfather's study one more time before I sign the papers. There was a brief pause. I suppose that would be appropriate. A sort of farewell to your old expectations. I'll meet you there at 3 o'clock. I'll bring the revised agreement. I've made a few small adjustments that I think you'll find even more generous. More generous. The audacity was breathtaking, but I kept my voice meek and grateful. Thank you, Penelope. I really appreciate how patient you've been with me during this difficult transition. After hanging up, I spent the next few hours carefully staging the study. I returned Grandfather's letter and most of the documents to their hiding place, but I kept a few key pieces of evidence easily accessible. I also took the time to call the law firm that had been secretly working on my behalf, Cromwell, Davidson and Associates, and arranged for Mr. Davidson himself to be available by phone at 3:30. When Penelope arrived at exactly 3 o'clock, she looked every inch the new mistress of the estate. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she carried herself with the confident air of someone who had successfully conquered her world. The fake signet ring glinted on her finger as she gestured around the study with proprietary satisfaction. "It's strange being back here, isn't it?" she said, settling into Grandfather's chair without invitation. "This room holds so many memories. All those Sunday afternoon conversations where Grandfather tried to teach us about responsibility and legacy." She smiled with what appeared to be genuine nostalgia. "I think he would be pleased to know that his lessons ultimately took root, even if not in the way he originally expected." I sat in the smaller chair across from the desk, the same one I had occupied during countless chess games and philosophical discussions. "You really believe you learned his lessons?" "Of course I did. The most important lesson of all. That good intentions without practical wisdom can be incredibly dangerous. Grandfather loved your compassionate heart, Cassandra, but he recognized that compassion without strategic thinking leads to squandered resources and missed opportunities." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a new version of the family support agreement. "I've increased the monthly stipend to $3,500, and I've reduced the financial reporting requirements. You'll only need to submit quarterly reports now, and the spending approval threshold has been raised to $750. The condescension in her voice as she presented these improvements to my financial prison was almost comical now that I knew the truth. But I maintained my defeated demeanor, even managing to look touched by her generosity. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said quietly. "But before I sign anything, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain that Grandfather's will is being executed exactly as he intended?" Something flickered across Penelope's face, too quick to identify. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about some of the things he said during our last conversations. Remarks about tests and character, and knowing someone's true nature. I keep wondering if there might be more to his plan than either of us understood." Penelope's laugh was forced, lacking the easy confidence she had displayed the day before. "Grandfather was an old man facing his mortality, Cassandra. Sometimes elderly people say cryptic things that seem meaningful but are really just the rambling thoughts of someone trying to make sense of their legacy. You're reading too much into casual comments." "Maybe you're right," I said, but I let doubt creep into my voice. "It's just that he was always so careful about everything, so strategic. Remember how he used to say that the most important moves in chess are the ones your opponent doesn't see coming?" I watched as a shadow of uncertainty crossed her features. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing specific," I replied, standing up and walking to the bookshelf where I had found the hidden compartment. "I suppose I'm just wondering if he might have had contingency plans that none of us knew about. You know how much he valued thorough preparation." I ran my fingers along the spine of one of the medical textbooks, noting how Penelope's eyes tracked my movement with growing unease. "Cassandra," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "if you're having second thoughts about accepting the terms of the inheritance, you should know that delay tactics won't change anything. The legal documents are ironclad." "Oh, I'm sure they are," I agreed, turning back to face her. "I'm sure whoever prepared them was very thorough. Tell me, how did you first get connected with Whitmore and Associates? Did you seek them out, or did they contact you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. What does that matter? They're one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Just curious about the process." "It must have been complicated, navigating all the legal requirements for contesting a will and restructuring an inheritance. Especially with the time frame involved, 8 months is quite a long time to orchestrate such a comprehensive legal strategy." Penelope's composure was beginning to crack in small but noticeable ways. Her hands had developed a slight tremor, and she kept glancing around the study as if expecting something to leap out at her. The timeline was necessary to ensure everything was done properly, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Of course, I agreed. And Dr. Fletcher's cooperation must have been crucial. It's remarkable how detailed his documentation was, going back so many months. Almost as if he had been expecting to need such reports. Dr. Fletcher is a professional, Penelope said stiffly. He recognized concerning patterns and documented them appropriately. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Grandfather and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. You know what's interesting? I called the hospital yesterday to clarify some dates, and according to their records, your volunteer application was submitted with a specific reference from Dr. Fletcher requesting that you be placed in the pediatric ward. That's unusual for new volunteers. I turned back to see Penelope staring at me with barely concealed alarm. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, I said innocently. I'm just noticing some interesting coincidences. Like how Dr. Fletcher's first incident report about my supposedly unprofessional behavior was dated before you had even started volunteering. How did he know to start documenting problems that hadn't occurred yet? The color was draining from Penelope's face. There must be some mistake in the dates. Maybe, I interrupted gently, or maybe someone asked him to prepare those reports in advance, just in case they might be needed for some future purpose. Penelope stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I don't like what you're suggesting, Cassandra. If you have accusations to make them clearly. I'm not making accusations, I said, my voice still calm and thoughtful. I'm just wondering if Grandfather might have been conducting a different kind of test than either of us realized. The kind of test where the real question wasn't whether I was fit to inherit his wealth, but whether you were the kind of person who would try to steal it. The silence that followed was deafening. Penelope's face had gone completely pale, and I could see her mind racing as she began to understand the implications of what I was suggesting. That's impossible, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Is it? I asked, pulling out my phone. There's one way to find out. Why don't we call Cromwell, Davidson and Associates and ask them to clarify exactly which law firm has been handling the real estate settlement? Penelope's eyes widened in horror. What are you talking about? Whitmore and Associates has been handling everything. Have they? I smiled for the first time since she had arrived. Or have they been handling only the part of the inheritance that was designed to test your character? As I began dialing the number for Cromwell, Davidson and Associates, I watched my sister's world begin to collapse around her, just as mine had collapsed the day before. The difference was that her collapse was real. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Cromwell, Davidson and Associates, this is Mr. Davidson speaking. I put the call on speakerphone, watching as Penelope's face went from pale to ashen. Mr. Davidson, this is Cassandra Ashworth. I'm here with my sister Penelope, and we have some questions about our grandfather's estate settlement. Ah, Miss Ashworth. Mr. Davidson's voice warmed considerably. I've been expecting your call. I trust you've had time to review the materials we discussed. Penelope was staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Her hands gripped the arms of Grandfather's chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Yes, I have, I replied, maintaining eye contact with my sister. Could you clarify for my sister exactly which aspects of the inheritance you've been handling versus other firms? Certainly. Cromwell, Davidson and Associates has been managing the primary estate distribution according to the codicil executed 6 months before your grandfather's passing. Whitmore and Associates was engaged to handle what your grandfather termed the preliminary scenario, essentially creating legal documents that would be valid only if certain conditions were met. Penelope made a small, strangled sound. And what were those conditions? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The preliminary inheritance would take effect only if the secondary beneficiary, that would be your sister, chose to pursue legal action against the primary beneficiary using falsified or manipulated evidence. In that event, the preliminary documents would serve as, shall we say, a temporary deception, while the real inheritance protection mechanisms were activated. I see, I said calmly. And has the secondary beneficiary pursued such action? Indeed, she has. We received notification yesterday that Ms. Penelope Ashworth filed the preliminary inheritance documents with the probate court, claiming ownership of the estate based on what our investigation has revealed to be fabricated medical reports and fraudulent character assessments. The phone slipped from Penelope's nerveless fingers and clattered onto the desk. She was breathing in short, rapid gasps, and I could see the exact moment when the full scope of her situation became clear to her. Mr. Davidson, I continued, what happens now that those conditions have been met? The codicil becomes active immediately. All assets previously assigned to your sister in the preliminary documents now transfer to you, including the house where you're currently located, the stock portfolio, the art collection, and the liquid assets. Your sister's inheritance is now limited to the trust fund originally designated for you, approximately $36,000 per year, $3,600 per month, exactly what she had generously offered me, but annually instead of monthly. There is one additional matter, Mr. Davidson continued. Your grandfather's instructions specify that if the test revealed evidence of criminal fraud, which the use of falsified medical documents certainly qualifies as, the secondary beneficiary would also be responsible for all legal fees incurred by both law firms during this process. Penelope suddenly lurched forward and grabbed the phone. This is insane, she shouted. You can't change an inheritance after someone has already claimed it. I have legal documents. I have court filings. Ms. Ashworth, Mr. Davidson's voice remained professionally calm. I understand your distress, but I'm afraid those documents were specifically designed to be temporary and contingent. They clearly state in the fine print, which I assume you didn't read carefully, that they are subject to modification based on subsequent revelations about the validity of the evidence used to obtain them. But I spent money. I made commitments. I put a down payment on a house in the Marina District. I bought a car. Penelope's voice was becoming increasingly hysterical. That was unwise, Mr. Davidson observed. The preliminary documents explicitly warned against making major financial commitments until the final estate settlement was complete. I believe the waiting period was specified as 6 months from the date of filing. I thought about the expensive clothes, the designer handbag, the Cartier watch, all purchased with money she thought she had inherited but which had never actually been hers. Furthermore, Mr. Davidson continued, Dr. Fletcher has provided us with comprehensive documentation of your attempts to recruit him in creating fraudulent medical evidence. He was instructed by your grandfather to cooperate with your requests while secretly recording all conversations. These recordings will be turned over to the medical board and the district attorney's office for review. Penelope sank back into the chair, her face now completely drained of color. This can't be happening, she whispered. I'm afraid it is, I said gently. Grandfather gave you every opportunity to choose differently. You could have refused to use the fabricated reports. You could have supported me instead of trying to destroy me. You could have chosen family loyalty over personal gain at any point during the past 8 months. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt a cold smile cross my face. Actually, Penelope, there's something else you should know. I just received a message from Mrs. Henderson at the Marina District Real Estate Office. She wants to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow morning about some irregularities in your mortgage application. Penelope's head snapped up. What irregularities? Well, it seems that when you applied for the mortgage on that house you mentioned, you listed the Elmwood Drive estate as collateral and claimed to have liquid assets of $12 million. But since you never actually owned those assets, I shrugged, I believe that constitutes mortgage fraud. The reality of her situation was hitting her in waves now. Not only had she lost the inheritance she thought she had stolen, but her attempts to leverage that inheritance for additional purchases had created a cascade of legal problems that would follow her for years. There's more, I continued, checking another message on my phone. The hospital board met this morning to discuss the fraudulent medical reports that were submitted in connection with the inheritance case. Dr. Fletcher has been suspended pending investigation, and they're reviewing all volunteer activities from the past year. Penelope was hyperventilating now. But I volunteered hundreds of hours. I was supposed to be appointed to the Community Outreach Committee. Yes, about that, I said, consulting yet another message. The volunteer coordinator called me an hour ago. Apparently, several parents have come forward with complaints about your behavior during your time in the pediatric ward. They reported that you seemed more interested in observing and photographing the volunteers than in actually helping the children. It was true. Once Mrs. Hendricks had started asking questions about Penelope's activities, a pattern of surveillance and documentation had emerged that had made several staff members and parents uncomfortable. And finally, I said, standing up and walking to the window, I should mention that the country club has asked for a meeting with you tomorrow afternoon. It seems there are some questions about recent charges to the family account that were made after grandfather's death, but before you had legal authority to access family funds. Each revelation was like another blow to someone who was already down. Penelope sat in grandfather's chair, the chair she had claimed so confidently just an hour earlier, looking like a broken doll. How, she whispered, how did he plan for all of this? Because he knew you, I said simply. He knew exactly what you would do when given the opportunity to take something that wasn't yours. He knew you would rationalize it, justify it, and convince yourself that you deserved it. And he knew that once you started down that path, you wouldn't be able to stop yourself from going further and further. I walked to the bookshelf and retrieved the hidden box, pulling out one final document that I hadn't shown her yet. This is a letter he wrote specifically for you, I said, holding up an envelope marked with her name. He wanted you to read it after the test was complete, regardless of the outcome. Penelope took the envelope with shaking hands and tore it open. As she read, tears began streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition and devastating self-awareness. I didn't need to read grandfather's final letter to my sister to know what it said. He had loved her too, but he had also seen her clearly. And sometimes, true love meant allowing someone to face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences were painful. The phone rang again. This time it was my number, and I answered it with growing confidence. Miss Ashworth, this is Detective Morrison from the Millbrook Heights Police Department. We've received some concerning reports about potential fraud and would like to schedule an interview with you and your sister at your earliest convenience. As I scheduled the appointment, I watched Penelope reading grandfather's letter, seeing herself through his eyes for perhaps the first time in her life. The test was over, the results were in, and justice, as grandfather had always believed, was finally being served. The next morning, I arrived at the Millbrook Heights police station with a leather portfolio containing all the evidence grandfather had so carefully preserved. Detective Morrison was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the demeanor of someone who had seen enough human nature to not be surprised by much. Ms. Ashworth, he said, leading me to a small conference room, I understand this is a complex family matter involving inheritance fraud and falsified medical documents. Why don't you start from the beginning? I spent the next hour methodically laying out the timeline of Penelope's deception. Detective Morrison took careful notes as I presented Dr. Fletcher's audio recordings, the fabricated incident reports, the evidence of Penelope's surveillance activities at the hospital, and the documentation of her attempts to manipulate legal proceedings through fraudulent claims. This is quite extensive, Detective Morrison observed, reviewing the transcripts. Your grandfather was remarkably thorough in documenting everything. These recordings of your sister's conversations with Dr. Fletcher clearly show intent to commit fraud, and the backdated medical reports constitute criminal falsification of documents. He looked up from the papers with something that might have been admiration. I've been investigating financial crimes for 20 years, and I've never seen a case where the victim so thoroughly documented their own victimization before it even occurred. Just then, there was a knock on the conference room door. A young officer poked his head in. Detective Morrison, Miss Penelope Ashworth is here for her appointment. Through the window, I could see my sister in the lobby, and the sight was shocking. In less than 24 hours, she had aged years. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her makeup hastily applied, and she kept checking her phone with the desperate urgency of someone hoping for a reprieve that would never come. "Would you like to observe the interview?" Detective Morrison asked. "We have a one-way viewing room." 40 minutes later, I watched through the mirror as my sister broke down completely under Detective Morrison's methodical questioning. She had arrived with a lawyer, a nervous young man from a budget legal firm who clearly wasn't equipped to handle a case of this magnitude, but it quickly became apparent that her legal position was hopeless. "Ms. Ashworth," Detective Morrison said, spreading out the evidence on the table, "we have recordings of you explicitly asking Dr. Fletcher to backdate medical reports to support your inheritance claim. How do you explain this?" Penelope's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear, but she seemed beyond listening to legal advice. "I didn't know they were fake," she insisted. "Dr. Fletcher told me they were legitimate professional observations." "Really?" Detective Morrison pulled out one of the transcripts. "Because according to this recording from your meeting on September 15th, you specifically said, and I quote, 'We need something that shows she was emotionally unstable at least 6 months ago, before she started corresponding with that charity organization.'" The color drained from Penelope's face as her own words were read back to her. "And here," the detective continued, "from your October 3rd meeting, can you make it look like there was a pattern of concerning behavior? Maybe multiple incidents over several months? That doesn't sound like someone who believed the reports were genuine professional observations." Her lawyer was frantically taking notes, clearly realizing that his client had incriminated herself beyond any possibility of defense. "Furthermore," Detective Morrison said, opening another file, "we've received additional complaints this morning. The First National Bank has filed a formal fraud report regarding your mortgage application. You claimed liquid assets of $12 million that you never actually possessed." Penelope's hands were shaking as she reached for her water glass. "But I had legal documents showing I inherited that money." "Documents that you knew were obtained through fraudulent means," the detective replied. "Using falsified evidence to obtain legitimate-looking legal documents is still fraud, Ms. Ashworth." The interview continued for another hour, each question revealing another layer of Penelope's elaborate deception. By the end, even her inexperienced lawyer was advising her to consider a plea bargain. After the interview concluded, Detective Morrison met with me again. "We'll be filing formal charges for inheritance fraud, falsification of medical documents, and mortgage fraud. There might be additional charges depending on what the financial investigation reveals." He paused, studying my face carefully. "I have to ask, how are you feeling about all this? I know she's your sister." I thought about the question for a long moment. "Sad," I said finally. "Not angry anymore, just sad. Grandfather gave her every opportunity to choose differently, and she made her choice at every decision point. These consequences aren't something I'm inflicting on her. They're the natural result of her own actions." That afternoon, I drove to Millbrook General Hospital for a meeting with the medical board. The boardroom was filled with doctors and administrators, including several people I recognized from my volunteer work. Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatric oncology, gave me a sympathetic smile as I took my seat. "Miss Ashworth," said Dr. Patricia Chen, the board chairwoman, "we want to first express our apologies for the trauma you've experienced. The hospital takes very seriously any breach of professional ethics by our staff." She pulled out a thick file. "Our investigation into Dr. Fletcher's conduct has revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior that extends beyond your family's situation. It appears he has been documenting and sharing confidential information about other volunteers and staff members without their knowledge or consent." I hadn't expected that. "Other people?" "Yes. We've discovered that he maintained detailed personal files on numerous hospital personnel, ostensibly for, quote, character assessment purposes. While his cooperation with your grandfather's test may have been motivated by friendship, his broader surveillance activities constitute serious violations of patient confidentiality and professional ethics. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. We're also concerned about the precedent this sets. If staff members feel they can manipulate volunteer evaluations for personal reasons, it undermines the integrity of our entire program. What will happen to him? I asked. His medical license is under review by the state board, Dr. Chen replied. The hospital has terminated his employment, and he's facing potential criminal charges for his role in the falsification of documents. Even if he was acting at your grandfather's request, he violated fundamental principles of medical ethics. The meeting continued with discussions about reforming the volunteer program and implementing better oversight procedures. As I listened to the administrators discuss policy changes that would protect future volunteers from similar manipulation, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Later that evening, I received a call from Mr. Davidson with more updates on the legal proceedings. The probate court has officially voided all of your sister's inheritance claims, he reported. The preliminary documents have been withdrawn, and the true inheritance distribution is now in effect. However, there are some complications regarding the assets she's already spent. What kind of complications? She put down payments on a house and a car, both of which she'll need to forfeit. She also made several large purchases using credit extended against the inheritance she thought she had. The creditors are now seeking recovery, and since she doesn't have the assets to cover the debts, she'll have to declare bankruptcy, I finished. Most likely, her actual inheritance, the $36,000 per year, won't be nearly enough to cover her current obligations. After hanging up, I sat in grandfather's study, now officially my study, thinking about the complete reversal of our situations. 24 hours ago, Penelope had been gloating over her apparent victory, while I faced financial ruin and legal threats. Now she was facing criminal charges, bankruptcy, and social disgrace, while I had inherited everything she thought she had stolen. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Penelope wasn't financial. It was social. Word of her scheme had spread quickly through Millbrook Heights' tight-knit community. The country club had revoked her membership. The charity boards she had hoped to join had withdrawn their invitations. Even her social circle was distancing themselves from the scandal. As I prepared for bed in the master suite of the Elmwood Drive mansion, my mansion now, I thought about grandfather's wisdom in designing such an elaborate test. He hadn't just wanted to determine who should inherit his wealth. He had wanted to create a situation where true character would be revealed beyond any possibility of deception. Penelope had revealed her character completely, and now she would have to live with the consequences of who she had chosen to be. The test was over, but the real work of justice was just beginning. 3 weeks later, I was in grandfather's study, my study, working on the preliminary plans for the Children's Medical Foundation when the doorbell rang. Through the tall windows, I could see a taxi pulling away from the circular driveway. Standing on the front steps, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, was Penelope. She was carrying a single suitcase and wearing clothes I didn't recognize. Simple, inexpensive garments that suggested her shopping days at designer boutiques were over. Her once perfect hair hung limp around her shoulders, and she had lost enough weight that her face looked gaunt and hollow. I opened the door slowly, unsure what to expect. We hadn't spoken since the day in the study when her world had collapsed, though I had followed her situation through the legal proceedings and news reports that had made our family's scandal front-page material in the local society pages. "Hello, Cassandra," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without speaking, and she walked into the foyer with the hesitant movements of someone entering a place where they were no longer certain they belonged. She looked around at the familiar surroundings, the antique furniture, the oil paintings, the Persian rugs, as if seeing them for the first time. "The house looks exactly the same," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "Did you expect me to redecorate immediately?" I asked, leading her toward the sitting room. I don't know what I thought. She sat down carefully on the edge of the sofa, placing her hands in her lap like a nervous child. I suppose I imagined you might want to erase all reminders of what happened. I poured tea from the service I had prepared, a ritual grandfather had taught me during our Sunday visits. The familiar motions felt grounding in the face of this surreal confrontation with my sister's transformed circumstances. "Where are you staying?" I asked, handing her a cup. "A small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe." She paused, staring into her tea. "The lawyer says the criminal charges will probably result in 18 months in minimum security prison, assuming I accept the plea bargain." The words hung in the air between us. 18 months. I tried to imagine my sister, who had never experienced genuine hardship, adapting to life in prison. "What about the financial situation?" "Bankruptcy," she said simply. "Everything has to be sold to pay back the creditors. The car, the jewelry, even the furniture I bought for the apartment I can't afford anymore." She looked up at me with eyes that held no trace of her former arrogance. "I lost everything, Cassandra. Not just the inheritance I thought I had stolen, but everything I actually owned before this started." I realized with surprise that I felt no satisfaction in her downfall. Where I had expected vindication or even cruel pleasure, I found only a profound sadness for what she had done to herself. "Why did you come here?" I asked gently. Penelope set down her teacup with shaking hands. I wanted to try to explain. Not to excuse what I did, there's no excuse for it, but to help you understand how I got so lost. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where we had played as children during family visits. "Do you remember when we were little, how Grandfather used to tell us stories about the family history, about Great-Uncle Thomas and the importance of responsibility?" I nodded, remembering those magical afternoons when Grandfather would regale us with tales of previous generations and their triumphs and failures. "I think I misunderstood the lesson," Penelope continued. "I heard the stories about Thomas squandering his inheritance, and I convinced myself that the moral was about being practical, about protecting wealth instead of giving it away. I thought Grandfather valued business sense over compassion." She turned back to face me, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But that wasn't the lesson at all, was it? The real lesson was about character, about choosing who you want to be when faced with difficult decisions. Grandfather tried to teach us both that wealth was a tool, not a destination," I said quietly. "The point wasn't to accumulate it or even to preserve it. It was to use it wisely to help others." "I know that now," Penelope whispered. I read his final letter to me so many times that I memorized every word. He wrote that he had watched me become increasingly focused on material success, increasingly willing to compromise my values for personal advantage. He said he hoped the test would give me a chance to choose a different path. She sat back down, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her regrets. Instead, I proved him right about everything he feared I might become. The silence stretched between us as we both contemplated the magnitude of her fall and the irreversible nature of the choices she had made. "There's something else," Penelope said finally. "I found out about Dr. Martinez's conversation with the medical board, about how my actions affected other people at the hospital. I had heard about this from Dr. Martinez himself. Penelope's surveillance activities and Dr. Fletcher's broader misconduct had created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear among the hospital staff that had taken weeks to resolve. 3 volunteers quit the program because they felt unsafe," she continued. 2 nurses requested transfers to different departments. And Mrs. Rodriguez, Timothy's mother, she told the board that my presence during her son's treatment made her feel like the family was being watched and judged instead of cared for. The mention of little Timothy Rodriguez, the child whose illness had first prompted Dr. Fletcher to fabricate reports about my emotional instability, seemed to break something inside Penelope. She began to cry, not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the deep, wrenching sobs of genuine remorse. "I hurt so many people," she gasped between sobs. "Not just you. but innocent families who were already going through the worst experiences of their lives. I turned what should have been a place of healing into a place of surveillance and manipulation. I moved to sit beside her on the sofa, not quite touching, but close enough to offer comfort if she needed it. "Penelope, why are you telling me all this?" She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse, a plain, practical bag that was nothing like the designer accessories she used to carry. "Because I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the fraud and the legal violations, but the deeper betrayal. I betrayed your trust, our family's values, and my own integrity." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Slowly, she unwrapped it to reveal the replica signet ring that she had worn so proudly just weeks earlier. "This doesn't belong to me," she said, placing it on the coffee table between us. "It never did. Grandfather was right to have a fake made for the test. I wasn't worthy of wearing the real one." Looking at the ring, I realized this was the moment Grandfather had been planning for all along. Not just the revelation of Penelope's deception, but this confrontation where she would finally understand the full scope of what she had lost and what she had become. "I also wanted to ask your forgiveness," she continued, her voice steady now despite the tears. "Not because I expect you to give it, and not because it would change anything about my situation, but because I needed you to know that I recognize the magnitude of what I did to you, and I'm truly sorry." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine humility. The arrogance, the calculation, the sense of entitlement that had defined her personality for so long were gone, replaced by someone who had finally confronted the consequences of her choices. "I forgive you, Penelope," I said quietly, and was surprised to discover that I meant it completely. Her eyes widened in shock. "How can you? After everything I put you through, how can you possibly forgive me?" "Because holding on to anger would hurt me more than it would hurt you," I replied. "And because Grandfather taught me that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's behavior, it's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their mistakes." We sat together in the quiet afternoon light, two sisters who had been shaped by the same grandfather but had chosen vastly different paths. The test was over, the consequences had been delivered, and now we both had to figure out how to move forward with the people we had proven ourselves to be. "What will you do when you get out?" I asked. Penelope was quiet for a long moment. "I want to try to make amends somehow. Maybe volunteer work, if any organization will have me after this scandal. Maybe find a way to help other people avoid the mistakes I made." She paused. "I know I can never undo the damage I've caused, but maybe I can prevent others from going down the same path." As she prepared to leave, Penelope turned back one final time. "Cassandra, use it well. Use the inheritance the way Grandfather intended. You were always the one who understood what he was really trying to teach us." I watched from the window as she walked down the long driveway, carrying her single suitcase toward an uncertain future. The taxi that would take her back to her small apartment and her reduced circumstances was already waiting at the gate. The final confrontation was over. Justice had been served, forgiveness had been offered, and the true test, the test of who we both really were, had reached its conclusion. 6 months after that final conversation with Penelope, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the newly opened Thaddeus Ashworth Children's Medical Center, watching as families from across the state brought their children for the specialized care they could never have afforded elsewhere. The facility had been my first major project as the administrator of Grandfather's estate, and seeing it come to life felt like watching his dreams take physical form. Dr. Ashworth, called Dr. Martinez, approaching with a broad smile and a small girl in tow. "I'd like you to meet Emma Rodriguez, Timothy's little sister. Her family wanted to thank you personally for making her surgery possible." I knelt down to Emma's level, remembering Timothy and the way his illness had been used as ammunition in Penelope's campaign against me. Now his family was benefiting from the very foundation that her schemes had nearly prevented. "The doctors fixed my heart," Emma said proudly, showing me a small scar on her chest that would fade with time. "And Mama says you made it so we didn't have to pay money we don't have." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "We heard about what happened with your family, about the test your grandfather created. I wanted you to know that some good came from all that pain. Without this center, Emma would have had to wait years for surgery we couldn't afford. You saved my daughter's life." After they left, I walked through the center's corridors, observing the state-of-the-art equipment and the team of specialists who had agreed to work here at reduced rates to serve underprivileged families. It was everything Grandfather and I had envisioned during our Sunday conversations, but seeing it realized felt both triumphant and bittersweet. The success of the medical center had opened doors I never could have imagined. Harvard Medical School had offered me a position in their global health program, allowing me to complete my residency while developing international humanitarian projects. The Global Health Alliance had not only accepted me into their fellowship program, but had asked me to help design new funding models for sustainable healthcare in developing nations. Yet for all these professional achievements, the most profound changes had been personal. Living alone in the Elmwood Drive mansion had forced me to confront questions about legacy, responsibility, and the weight of expectations that I had never fully considered before inheriting Grandfather's burden along with his wealth. I had hired Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 60s, as both housekeeper and companion. She had worked for wealthy families her entire life and understood the peculiar loneliness that could come with inherited responsibility. Her practical wisdom and gentle humor had helped me navigate the transition from struggling medical student to guardian of a substantial family fortune. "Miss Cassandra," she said one evening, as I worked late in the study, "you've been staring at those financial reports for 3 hours. Your grandfather never worked past sunset when he could help it." She was right. I had been pushing myself relentlessly, driven by a combination of gratitude for the inheritance and determination to prove worthy of Grandfather's faith in me. But in my zealousness to honor his legacy, I had been neglecting the balance he had always tried to teach me. "Mrs. Patterson," I said, closing the laptop, "do you think Grandfather would be proud of what I've accomplished so far?" She settled into the chair across from the desk, the same chair where Penelope had signed her fraudulent documents and where she had later returned in defeat. "I think he would be proud that you're asking that question," she said thoughtfully. "Pride without humility was your sister's downfall. The fact that you're still worried about doing right by his memory suggests you understand what he was trying to teach you." The mention of Penelope brought a familiar mixture of sadness and hope. I had been receiving updates on her situation through the legal system and, surprisingly, through Dr. Martinez, who had maintained contact with her during her imprisonment. She had been released after serving 14 months of her sentence, with good behavior reducing her time. The reports I received painted a picture of someone genuinely trying to rebuild her life on a foundation of service rather than self-interest. She had earned her GED while in prison and had been accepted into a community college program for healthcare administration. Most remarkably, she had begun volunteering at a free clinic in the city's poorest neighborhood, working with patients who had no insurance and nowhere else to turn. Dr. Martinez had visited the clinic and reported that Penelope's transformation seemed genuine. She worked quietly, without seeking recognition, and had developed a reputation for exceptional compassion with the most difficult cases. "She's not the same person who walked into that study 18 months ago," he had told me during our last conversation. "I don't think she'll ever fully forgive herself for what she did, but she's channeling that guilt into something productive." This news had prompted me to make a decision that surprised even myself. I had anonymously donated money to the free clinic where Penelope volunteered, ensuring that they could expand their services and hire additional staff. It wasn't forgiveness money or guilt money. It was an investment in the possibility that people could genuinely change when faced with the consequences of their choices. The transformation hadn't been limited to Penelope. Dr. Fletcher had lost his medical license permanently, but he had used his enforced retirement to write a book about medical ethics and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. The proceeds from the book were being donated to organizations that provided mental health support for healthcare workers. Even Mrs. Hendricks at the hospital had found purpose in the scandal. She had developed new volunteer screening procedures and had become a national speaker on protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The hospital's volunteer program was now considered a model for other institutions. As I reflected on these ripple effects, I realized that Grandfather's test had accomplished something far beyond determining who should inherit his wealth. It had created a series of consequences that forced everyone involved to confront their true characters and choose who they wanted to become moving forward. The evening light was fading as I walked through the mansion's rooms, each one holding memories of family gatherings and quiet conversations with Grandfather. I had modernized some aspects of the house, installing better security systems and updating the kitchen, but I had preserved the essential character that made it feel like home. The study remained almost exactly as Grandfather had left it, except for one addition, a framed photograph of the Children's Medical Center's opening day, with Emma Rodriguez cutting the ribbon alongside her brother Timothy, who had fully recovered from his leukemia. It served as a daily reminder that the test's ultimate purpose hadn't been to punish Penelope or reward me, but to ensure that the family's resources would be used to heal rather than harm. My phone buzzed with a text message from the Global Health Alliance confirming my assignment to establish a pediatric clinic in rural Guatemala. The 6-month deployment would be my first major international project, and I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with new challenges. As I prepared for bed in the master suite that had once seemed too grand for someone my age, I thought about the conversation I had planned for the next day. I was meeting with a team of lawyers to establish a scholarship fund for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue careers in healthcare. The fund would be named after Grandfather, but its mission would be entirely forward-looking, creating opportunities for future healers who might otherwise never have the chance to develop their potential. The irony wasn't lost on me that Penelope's betrayal had ultimately led to far more good than her loyalty might have accomplished. If she had chosen differently, if she had supported me instead of trying to destroy me, we might have shared the inheritance and used it well. But we also wouldn't have learned the profound lessons about character, forgiveness, and redemption that had emerged from the test's dramatic conclusion. As I drifted off to sleep in the house that was now truly mine, I felt the peaceful satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to do, with exactly the resources you need to make a difference in the world. The test was over, but the real work, the work of healing, was just beginning. 2 years later, I stood in the departure lounge at Boston's Logan International Airport, watching planes take off through the massive windows while waiting for my flight to Guatemala City. My carry-on bag contained the essentials for establishing the new pediatric clinic: medical supplies, tablet computers loaded with patient management software, and a small wooden box that I carried everywhere now, the same box where Grandfather had hidden his final letters and the real family signet ring. The ring now rested on my finger, its weight both familiar and meaningful after 2 years of learning what it truly meant to inherit not just wealth, but the responsibility to use it wisely. The inscription on the inside, worn smooth by generations of Ashworth hands, read simply, "Service above self," words that had taken on profound meaning through the crucible of Grandfather's test. As I settled into my seat for the 6-hour flight, I pulled out the leather journal I had been keeping since that day in the study when I first discovered the truth. What had started as a way to process the shock and betrayal had evolved into something deeper, a record of lessons learned, a meditation on human nature, and ultimately a guide for others who might face their own tests of character. The journal's first entries were raw with pain and confusion, documenting the devastation of believing I had lost everything and everyone I trusted. But as I read through the pages now, I could trace the evolution of understanding that had transformed not just my circumstances but my entire worldview. The greatest test of character, I had written 6 months after the revelation, isn't how you handle success or even how you survive failure. It's how you choose to treat others when you have the power to help or harm them without consequence. This truth had been demonstrated not just by Penelope's choices during the test, but by my own decisions in its aftermath. I could have used my restored inheritance to destroy her completely, ensuring she faced maximum legal penalties and social exile. Instead, I had chosen a path that allowed for redemption while still holding her accountable for her actions. The results had been remarkable. Penelope was now in her second year of community college, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the free clinic and volunteering at a literacy program for adult learners. She had written me several letters over the past year, not asking for money or forgiveness, but sharing updates on the patients she was helping and the courses she was taking in healthcare administration. Her most recent letter had included a photograph of a graduation ceremony where she had received an award for community service. In the picture, she was surrounded by former patients from the clinic, their faces glowing with affection for someone who had genuinely earned their trust through consistent, selfless action. I understand now, she had written, that the real inheritance wasn't money at all. It was the opportunity to discover who we really were when everything was stripped away. You found compassion and strength. I found my capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Grandfather gave us both exactly what we needed, even if it wasn't what we expected. This insight had led to one of my most profound realizations. Grandfather's test hadn't been designed to punish anyone, but to create the conditions where authentic transformation could occur. By putting us in situations where our true natures would be revealed, he had given each of us the chance to consciously choose who we wanted to become. The airplane lifted off, and I watched Boston shrink below us, thinking about the presentation I would give next week to a gathering of international development organizations. I had been invited to speak about sustainable healthcare funding models, but I planned to focus on something more fundamental: the importance of character-based decision-making in humanitarian work. Too often I had observed well-intentioned people created dependency rather than empowerment, because they approached charity from a position of superiority rather than partnership. Grandfather's test had taught me that true service required not just resources, but humility, wisdom, and the courage to hold people accountable for their choices while still offering them hope for redemption. The Children's Medical Center had become a model for this approach. Rather than simply providing free healthcare, we had created programs that engaged families as partners in their children's wellness. Parents attended financial literacy classes while their children received treatment. Teenagers participated in peer counseling programs. Community members were trained as health advocates who could identify problems before they became emergencies. The results spoke for themselves. Not only were we treating more children than any similar facility in the region, but we were seeing measurable improvements in community health indicators and family stability. By treating people as capable partners rather than passive recipients, we had created a sustainable system that would continue helping families long after any individual donation was spent. This philosophy had influenced every aspect of my work with the Global Health Alliance as well. Instead of parachuting into communities with predetermined solutions, our team spent months learning about local resources, cultural practices, and community priorities before proposing any interventions. The clinic I was heading to Guatemala to establish would be owned and operated by local healthcare workers, with our foundation providing initial funding and ongoing technical support rather than permanent oversight. As the plane reached cruising altitude, I opened my laptop and began reviewing the profiles of the Guatemalan medical students who would be joining our team. Each had been selected not just for their clinical skills, but for their demonstrated commitment to serving marginalized populations. They reminded me of myself at their age, passionate, idealistic, and perhaps naive about the complexities of changing the world. But naivete, I had learned, wasn't necessarily a weakness. The willingness to believe that profound change was possible, even in the face of systemic obstacles and human frailty, was often what made the difference between resignation and transformation. Grandfather had been naive enough to believe that an elaborate test could reveal and reshape character. I had been naive enough to believe that forgiveness could coexist with justice. Penelope had been naive enough to believe that she could rebuild her life from the ashes of her mistakes. In every case, our naivete had been vindicated by results that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The flight attendant brought dinner, and I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Mrs. Patterson before leaving for Guatemala. She had been preparing my favorite meal, the same Sunday roast that Grandfather used to request when Penelope and I visited as children, and I had asked her what she thought he would say about the direction my life had taken. "I think," she had replied thoughtfully, "he would say that you finally understand the difference between being wealthy and being rich." The distinction had puzzled me until she explained, "Wealthy is about having money. Rich is about having the wisdom to use whatever resources you possess, money, time, knowledge, relationships, to create more good in the world than existed before you arrived." By that definition, I realized Penelope had become rich despite her financial poverty. The patients at her clinic were healthier because of her dedication. The adult learners in her literacy program were more confident because of her encouragement. The community college classmates she tutored in healthcare administration were better prepared to serve others because of her support. She had discovered that the most valuable inheritance wasn't measured in dollars, but in the impact you had on other people's lives. As the plane began its descent toward Guatemala City 6 hours later, I looked out at the landscape below, mountains and valleys that would soon become familiar, communities that would soon become partners in our shared work of healing. I thought about Grandfather's words from that final letter. The most important test of your life won't be whether you can be ruthless or calculating, but whether you can remain true to yourself even when everything seems lost. The test had ended years ago, but its lessons continued to guide every decision I made. In the end, Grandfather had given us something far more valuable than money. He had given us the opportunity to discover who we really were and who we had the potential to become. That, I realized as we touched down in a new country where I would spend the next year of my life serving others, was the greatest inheritance of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.